Hello, you're listening to Future Artifacts FM, a radio show hosted by Niamh Schmitdke and Nina Davies.
Earlier this year, several radio frequencies were discovered airing a collection of broadcasts. At first, they sounded like regular news stories and interviews. They felt familiar, but also not quite belonging to our present. Slowly, the listeners came to believe that what they were listening to did indeed belong to their world, just not their time. They were looking into the future through the mundane edges of radio recordings and public service announcements. While this material is still being meticulously studied by researchers in various universities and museums, your hosts have managed to gain access to this collection to air a selection of these broadcasts for you, our listeners.
For full disclosure, we will not be sharing this collection with you, as this introduction is based on a fictional event. In this monthly broadcast, Future Artifacts FM, we will present speculative fiction pieces by artists and writers, followed by conversation with hosts Niamh Schmitdke and Nina Davies. The programme will focus on fictional works intended for broadcast, such as radio plays or fictional interviews, to carve out a better understanding of the now by exploring various interpretations of the future.
Welcome back to Future Artifacts, episode 22. We are actually, in fact, recording on the same day that we recorded the last episode, so this is kind of funny going from one episode straight to the next. I guess the first thing I want to say is if you have not listened to episode 21, please do listen to episode 21 because this is our first two-part episode. And today is Niamh Schmitdke, who you'll all be familiar with, is sharing their work Pulling Blood from a Stone, which is a 35-minute audio play or radio play, and we'll be listening to it's a 4-act play, and we're listening to the second 2 acts. Niamh, I'll let you go. I'll let you explain a little bit more.
Yeah, listening to the second half. We kind of said this in the beginning of the last episode, but we decided to split it into 2 because it's quite a long work, and also I would say it's quite a dense work, so we kind of thought we'd be better off splitting it into 2. And also we have the wonderful guest co-presenter Alberto De Man with us on this episode again. Welcome back.
Hello.
So this episode we're listening to the second half of the work. The first half of the piece is kind of set farther back in time, so it starts off 2 billion years ago. It goes to the Irish Iron Age in 500 BC. And then this half is set closer to the present. So I should say as well, a short trigger warning, there is a little bit of a description of colonial violence at the beginning of this work. It's not extreme, it's more so that there are screams, but just so you know in advance of listening to the work that's what we'll be talking about a little bit. This is part of the 3rd edition of the Earth, Water, Sky residency program curated by Ariane Cook and funded by Fondation Didier et Martin Primat and produced with Science Gallery Network as part of a residency done with the Technological University of Berlin's Mineralogical Collection since 2023, which will be culminating in an exhibition opening this summer.
Great. Well, this second half of the work will be roughly around 15 minutes, 15 to 17 minutes. We suggest that you listen to this work on headphones. So we'll see you on the other side. Bye. Bye.
Who
were the first mineralogists? Can you hear them? Do their voices permeate the explosive blasts and the journey below sea level? Do you think they were peaceful, righteous, plunderers? Where does the line between conquest and science become political? Sitting green, crouched in protection, centuries of care and locality, Hidden in the Atavi Mountains, a local legend. The land sold for 25 muskets and a horse, washed down with a barrel of brandy. Mining rights stolen between the values of European settlers and individual wealth. Now we wait for the white hand of greed, because geologically profitable anomalies face this carved line. In protection and hatred of copper, the largest output within the German colonies. When does the dignity come? The spokesperson, the defender. Was the mine flooding a protest? The cave-ins a strike? Was there more to be done? Minerals extracted, lifted to the surface, trained to the Atlantic, buried to the Kaiser. What rebellion is possible for the inanimate? The rumbles of the mantle, a manifestation of our distraught, gauging the weight of time. Living in the hope for self-determination, for Namibian prosperity, fair division of wealth, apologies for genocide, and reparations.
They're coming, as though they've got a local guide. One of the Nama or Herero people, maybe, hunting anything green.
Why else would we have been divided and sold? Their lines drawn, speaking in these tongues, mined by these people, by this oppressor.
But why now? What happened to our peace? The slowness, consideration?
The new ones are not of here. Ever since 1884, they've connected us to Berlin, and back again.
Is that when we were sold off?
Stolen off. The deal was mistaken, deliberately misunderstood. Some white man on a mission to generate his fame and fortune.
Is that why you're hiding here, 40 meters deep?
And why he's no longer here, left with his tail between his legs for the German government to fulfill the dirty work.
That's why the machines came. And the people. Factories, industry, town, ownership, rush gold minerals.
Calm. It's okay. It will get better.
How? How is it supposed to be getting easier if we are being blasted? And all these men are dying down here with us.
We need to live in faith of a better future.
We need to attack. To do something. I can't simply sit here. Do you feel lost yet?
Plundered. Yes.
Is that all you have to say? Plundered is only the start of what I'm feeling.
The advent of industrialization. The invasion of colonizers. The categorization of our elements. What do you want me to say? There's nothing I can do to change it. I'm worried about riling you up. There's no good end to these thoughts.
Or what if it's really comfort? You seem too comfortable with this violence. This feeling seems to run deeper, something more ingrained. Is it our toxic makeup?
White powder on skin?
Not just heavy metals powder settling into someone's lungs, splitting apart the surface, breaking water level, flooding from below.
It is not your fault.
Oh, Zoomap, I didn't mean to speak loudly.
You do not need to blame yourselves. You were not formed for the people. Your value is not defined by them.
It is not all people. Only the recent ones. Pale and blonde and speaking in a foreign language.
One I've had to adapt.
Remember, we are not simply the present moment. We will continue past. We will not forget what is happening here.
But we're living through it. Blown apart, sifted, floated and dried. Melted down for another weapon, railway, another European capital.
I want to care for the locals.
And we will.
Mich interessieren Mineralien, die sich in naturwissenschaftlichen Sammlungen und Museen in Europa befinden. Die modernen Geowissenschaften sind eng mit dem europäischen Kolonialismus verbunden. Sie lieferten die Daten für die Ausbeutung von Rohstoffen und die Legitimation für Gewalt an Menschen und Natur. Und wenn man sich mit der Aneignung, der Klassifizierung und Darstellung von Mineralien beschäftigt, wird eben deutlich, wie sich diese Machtstrukturen in der musealen Inszenierung bis heute halten. Viele Mineralien wurden als Belegstücke für geologische Forschung aus den Kolonien nach Europa verbracht oder stehen in Zusammenhang mit der Ausbeutung von Rohstoffen. Diese Kontexte werden in den Sammlungen bislang kaum thematisiert. In meinen Recherchen bin ich auf die Mineralzeichnungen beispielsweise von Reinhard Brauns gestoßen, die er 1903 in dem Buch Das Mineralreich veröffentlicht hat und die im Senckenberg-Museum in Frankfurt am Main ausgestellt sind. Und auf den ersten Blick sind das sehr faszinierende, sehr detailreiche Zeichnungen von Mineralien. Die Mineralien stammen aus unterschiedlichen deutschen Sammlungen. Und Brauns schreibt aber nicht nur über die Mineralogie, sondern er vergleicht die Welt der Mineralien mit der imperialen Territorialverteilung. Er beschreibt, wie sich die Mineralien zu ihrem Muttergestein wie Kolonien zu den imperialen Zentren verhalten. Und der Bergmann, so Brauns, sei eben der Herr der Erde, weil er die wertvollen Ressourcen wie Gold und Metall für das tägliche Leben nutzbar mache. Es gibt also eine sehr starke geosoziale Komponente, die der Autor mit einbezieht und die eben gleichzeitig auf das imperiale Denken hinter der Auseinandersetzung mit den Mineralien verweist. Und diese historischen Zeugnisse machen die Sammlung so interessant. Und sie sind heute da und zeigen das Unbehagen der Museen, sich eben mit der Kolonialvergangenheit zu befassen. Feministische Autorinnen wie Carolyn Merchant oder Maria Mies haben in den 1980er Jahren aufgezeigt, wie mit dem Aufkommen der modernen Naturwissenschaften im 18. und 19. Jahrhundert die Verbindung von Menschen, insbesondere Frauen und der Natur, also auch Mineralien, zerstört wurde. Und Maria Mies beschreibt sehr eindrücklich, wie europäische Kolonisatoren gewaltvoll in die Natur eindrangen und ihre BewohnerInnen ausbeuteten, wie sie sich den alten naturphilosophischen Regeln widersetzten und die Natur eben nicht mehr als lebendigen Organismus respektierten. Und in diesem Zusammenhang wurden Mineralien als ökonomische Vorratslager verstanden. Und das ist auch die moderne Vorstellung von Rohstoffen. Ich glaube, es wäre falsch, von einer Dekolonialisierung mineralogischer Sammlungen zu sprechen. Koloniale Macht gehört zu der DNA der Sammlung und der Institutionen wie Universitäten oder Museen. Und das lässt sich nicht einfach verändern. Ich glaube aber, dass dekoloniales Denken ein guter Ansatzpunkt sein kann, um die richtigen Fragen an die Sammlung zu stellen, die uns heute und in einer dekolonialen Debatte interessieren.
Stop. The pulse is coming.
Don't get too flustered. There's only so much heat I can handle.
Right. That's why they poured you down the fires at Chernobyl.
In much larger quantities. At least I had a purpose back in the 80s.
Because keeping some posh Berliner's mobile going isn't noble enough for you.
Please. They're almost at the socket. I can feel it.
Because we definitely couldn't see it.
What bad mood did you wake up out of today? A Chinese mine? A US environmental dump?
Scandinavian humanitarian crisis.
Shh! We're gonna speak in a minute. There. Now let's discuss. It is indigenous rights, correct?
The Sami.
Another land grab, I'm guessing?
Another national mine.
Despite the movement of Kiruna City eastwards in the 2020s?
More deposits have been found. A fresh fleet of electric cars.
I thought the recycling centers were getting better. They've found great methods for lithium.
Thank goodness for Chile and Bolivia. The recycling plant is far less polluting than the floating pools.
But they were so beautiful from above. All those New Yorker articles.
I am sure the medical centers keep that in mind while treating patients.
And once they see what their conditions have enabled?
The medical apps? You don't even need to visit a doctor in person now. Or at least the person owning this phone doesn't.
Seems like they are struggling with depression.
Are you going to give them a little lithium for that?
Even I know that's too strong for them. You're off track. What about the Sami? Can you see anything online about it?
I can hear them.
The Sami?
The minerals. Bastnasite, monazite, scandium. They're trying to revolt.
Against the machines?
That's not possible. No mineral has been successful.
That's what you think. Crashing mine tunnels, opals splitting in oxygen, salt covered in metals, rusting iron.
That's not revolution, merely chemical reaction.
They're not happy about Kiruna. But I can also hear things from Aitik, Björnevatn, Kvanevan, and Kitila.
It is plant?
It's difficult to make out.
What can you hear?
Something big.
How can we help? I could connect them to the uprisings in Chile. The Atacameños negotiate a peace for their people and the minerals, a collaborative structure of all the beings in the desert. Where luminous pools of yellow and blue once were, they now live alone for the ground to heal.
A cross-species movement?
Even with humans?
Not all humans.
What about our one? They're coming back.
What good are we in a mineral revolution? We have already been processed. We have already lost.
We could bring together our networks. We're attached to the electrical grid. There must be millions of us interconnected.
Sounds like the beginning of a science fiction novel.
It's the beginning of something.
Maybe if we find a way to tap into the electrical supply of the charging cable, there could be a frequency we could talk to.
They're coming back. If you want to make some communication, the time is now.
Wait!
We are running out of time.
I found a wave to pass our message.
Go, go, go!
It's sent.
What did you send out?
That we're all connected.
How do you pull blood from a stone? Well, first, what is a stone? A group of minerals fused together, crystallizing and giving form to the limestone, marble, or granite we understand underneath our palms. Minerals holding hands, squeezed up tight and in close proximity, intimate. Does this proximity give them life? Does it give them blood? Are they even alive, or is immortality merely the absence of death? And what do I mean when I ask you to pull blood from a stone? In English, we use this to imply someone isn't talking much. Their answers are all yes or no. One word. What might a stone say to this? Why do we assume their language would be short because we, humans, are unable to hear a rock speak? What language does a diamond speak? How would it talk to a piece of olivine, or a ruby, or the calcite stalactites growing from the tunnels of the Uban? What might those conversations sound like? Does it bleed fast or slow? It's violent to link one's voice to the blood in their veins. What does this imply for the inanimate, the soft-spoken, the non-verbal, or the immortal? It is not best practice to fill in the gaps of these voices with your own lines. Theatrical renditions of a mineral's psychology, anthropomorphized fantasies of our role in mining, crystal carving, or clay, and the very technology we understand these messages through. Is this how we pull blood? Through the crushing, heating, smelting of millennia-old beings, subjected to the voices we provide, the keys of a computer, vibrations of a speaker, carvings in buildings, or the shutter closing on a camera? What voices are we hearing? Are our messages molded by the voices of rocks around us? Or the other way around?
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed listening to Pulling Blood from a Stone, Acts 3 and 4, as well as the interludes in between each work. To start things off, Niamh, in the third act, which is obviously the first act in the segment we listened to today, the characters are talking about wanting to care for the locals rather than the colonizing people, or the recent people, as they were referred to. I was wondering why you chose the minerals to have an affinity with specific groups of people.
Yeah, one of the things that I was doing a lot in my research or in my time in Germany was learning about Namibian history, or specifically, we kind of hinted at this in the last episode, but thinking about the writings of academics such as Catherine Yusof, who create this really strong connection academically between mineralogy, geology, and industrial colonization. I kind of make that distinction because by the time you get to these industrial forms of mining in the 1800s, there's this form of extraction that's more, or feels more racialized, perhaps. And so I was trying to think about what would that feel like for the minerals on the ground who maybe had been involved in other forms of mining practices beforehand. And so specifically this act, Act 3, is set in northern Namibia in a mining town called Tsumeb. Tsumeb is known as one of the most mineralogically rich and diverse places in the world. It is some of the largest varieties of minerals available, and it was the largest copper mine in the German Empire outside of Germany in the early 1900s. One of the really fascinating things about Tsumeb is that it was part of this really large copper trade by local tribes people, so the Ovaherero and the Ndonga coppersmiths prior to colonization, so from about the 1600s onwards, and that trade even travelled as far as 1,000 kilometers north into what is present-day Angola. So this huge trade, and it was very much this kind of connection of local peoples from those who would mine copper from different sites around Tsumeb to those who would smelt it into, let's say, usable metal, to those who would smith it into objects that you can kind of buy or trade or so forth. And so I was thinking about this much longer standing relationship, and would kind of a few hundred years of these forms of trade, how would that sit with a mineral versus, let's say, the sharp destruction of what was German colonization in Namibia. The opening of Act 3 is almost like a parable of the colonial rights and the kind of power transfer that happened from local people in Tsumeb to the German authorities. There's this story of a Scottish man buying what he thinks are the mining rights of Tsumeb with a specific kind of horse and a bottle of brandy and some guns. He bought the wrong thing. He kind of, as many Europeans in Africa at this time, he misunderstood what he was buying, and he assumed that the people he was buying it from were more stupid than they were. And so I was kind of thinking about what would happen when you have this form of, let's say, a kind of European stupidity come in to a place. How would a mineral relate to people that it perhaps understands the customs of in a different way versus an industrial mining complex? And then perhaps more specifically, a lot of the research into, let's say, colonial mining in the African continent in particular, this phrase that keeps on coming up is the resource curse. Thinking about places such as kind of the diamond industry in South Africa, kind of blood diamond industry with De Boers, and also looking at things like the humanitarian crisis in the DRC right now due to the, let's say, extremity of cobalt in the country. Cobalt and lithium kind of so necessary for modern battery production. But that becomes something that almost creates more exploitation by, let's say, more powerful or wealthier nations, such as European ones in the past, and mainly China in the present, and trying to think about, instead of having minerals be this curse, what could happen if they became protectors or actors that would want better for the locality. So at this time, this piece is kind of set in 1910, so it's just after the Namibian genocide has happened, and trying to think about if minerals were witnesses or viewers of this, or had an understanding of it through the earth, how might they want to engage? Is a cave-in of a mine a strike? You know, is that the earth saying no more?
It makes me think, I've spoken about it a bit on the show, about Catherine Hale's talking about different forms of processing information as a form of intelligence. And she does talk about how rocks think, or how they process information and move at a very slow pace. And there is that sort of, like, if a mine caves in, there is a processing of some sort of information.
I mean, even in terms of what scientists are now using to also date and locate rocks, is that, so for example, in this act, in Act 3, the two minerals we hear speaking are malachite and lead. And these are two of the minerals that are extracted the most out of Tsumeb at that time. Malachite is a mineral you can find all over the world. Notably, you also find it in Zimbabwe, you also find it in Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you go to a mineral collection and you see pieces of malachite from these different countries, you see that they look different, partially because of other trace elements in the mineral, partially because of how they form, so on. They can now take parts of mineral to almost like DNA sample it to where it came from in the world. And so that's how they can also demonstrate the trade routes and how far the trade routes went. But when you think about that in terms of, let's say, a mineral being extracted from somewhere and brought somewhere else, it still carries the location of its origin. Is that a form of, like, kinship it holds with the mountain? So in this case, the Atavi Mountains, which is where Tsumeb is located.
It kind of makes me think of, the famous Jean-Paul Getty's infamous quote, like, the meek shall inherit the earth, but not his mineral rights, which kind of spoke of the tendency of taking over ownership of mineral rights, because they are not specifically attributed to the people who populate that land. You know, it's in a sense, as you're saying, all form of dating that are now much more sophisticated. They can really place some sort of connections between ethnic groups living in a certain geographical area and their extractive histories. But then I think that's where we're heading. It's really interesting. We're heading obviously for legal implications here, right? I mean, the whole history of mineral rights is a struggle for either conceding or withholding mineral rights. without really asking those who seems to be the most appropriate to, even in kind of Western context, the idea of coming with trinkets to fool locals in order to grant them access to resources. It's a classic form of the theatrical of abusive relationship towards certain specific people. I mean, and this connects perhaps to something that we have already spoken about, but this is really enlarged in this Act 3, where this stereo image gives you a real feeling that you are quite participating in the act, which is, to what extent are we heading for possible forms of retributions? So can the locals claim some sort of ethno-nationalist rights that says, well, you will have to repay us for all the extractive gain that you had, because we do not recognize the very first act, which is you took it from us.
Well, for me, a lot of those legal systems have been constructed by Western powers and authority, at first in a way to create control over people within their own countries, so like in the UK over workers and labourers, and then in the future over those who were colonised by British upper classes, and then also working classes, also Irish people going to help colonise places like Australia and the American kind of Western frontier and gold mining rush and so forth. When I think about these types of relationships, so for example, if you look at like the Namibian genocide, which the German government have only issued a state apology in 2023, and they did this after 2-3 years of negotiations with the Namibian government, not with the ancestors of those who were killed in the genocide, because those are indigenous peoples. They're not people from towns. They're bushmen quite often. So this kind of framework, it doesn't seem to work in a way. So Dr. Melina Lauscherbach, she's the German woman that you hear in one of the intermissions. I was kind of talking to her about this, also about this idea of kind of decolonizing a mineral collection, and she has this great point about how, mineral collections and institutions in Western Europe in particular are inherently colonial. So it's like, how do we, and if we think about extending that to things like law and legal systems, even you look at the American Constitution, like the original one, or the Declaration of Independence, all men are equal unless you're a black man. Or a woman, there's all these factors to it. And if you think about them coming from this foundation, how are they supposed to, let's say, emancipate us from those colonial hierarchies in the present if that's rooted into them? I think there's other forms of relationship, and that's why I think a lot about intimacy and kinship rather than legality and like institutional structures, because I think there's something much more powerful in those in the present, and maybe those get rewritten back into some kind of legal structure. But I think, as you're saying, like all of those old, I don't even know if you can call them contracts, handshake agreements between, in this case, this tribesman, and it was a Scotsman that made the deal, between these two people to say, oh, I now own the land rights. That then got kicked about in the UK, it then got kicked about to the British government, and then the German government after the 1884 Berlin Conference was like, oh, okay, we'll take this. Since it's disputed, we'll take this. If you're trying to use that same system to emancipate when it has done so much harm, how do you not expect the same result?
In the overall work, Acts 1, 2 and 3 are set in real historical moments, and the last act, Act 4, presents us a global speculative future of Indigenous uprising, and if I'm right, a sort of health crisis as well. Is there anything in particular you've based this on or responding to in this section about our present now?
Yeah, so in terms of thinking about this mineral uprising in the future, maybe it's a version of the future that I would like to see coming into existence. Like how I'm mentioning the Ecuador and protection of the Amazon rainforest and the rivers that flow through it. But also I was looking a lot into the three actors within Act 3, which are lithium, this mineral called a rare earth element, and graphite. And these three things are what you find in a phone battery. And so the act is set within a phone battery. And I was thinking about how you see a lot of environmental statements that say there are enough minerals on the planet for a renewable energy transition. Kind of, we have enough to make enough batteries and so forth. And it comes from this perception of empty land, or that there is empty land, particularly for something like a rare earth element, which is the thing that makes your battery efficient. It means that we can have phones the size that they are. It's really, really effective at conducting electricity and these types of things. Quite a lot of that they're speculating, or they've started to find, is in northern Scandinavia, in Sami land, which is why you have one of the actors is voicing themselves as Sami. I mean, she's actually a German actress, but the idea is that she's trying to think about kind of a Sami perspective, the indigenous peoples across northern Scandinavia, Sami land, so from all the way from even parts of Russia through to northern Finland, Sweden, Norway. And so what happens if this empty land isn't empty? How do we relate to it? Looking at lithium and these kind of lithium lakes that you can see now, if you type up lithium lakes aerial views, you'll see these kind of really striking coloured pools of bright green, blue, yellow in the middle of the desert in Chile, but also in Bolivia. There's kind of this triangle that's set between three countries' borders. In the nearby desert, you have the Atacameños, which is who's referenced in the piece. And I guess I was trying to think about what would happen if their land was returned to them. How might they do it? But also, what lessons might they learn in that process? What might they share? And thinking about maybe like these forms of power, and how I feel like quite often we're seeing in really exciting democratic progress across South America. So it feels slightly more tangible to me that there might be an indigenous revolution there than there would be in Scandinavia, which talks a good game about being open and progressive, but is slowly becoming more far right and racist as time goes on. So I was trying to think about what kind of lessons might they learn from each other, how might they support each other. And similarly, graphite is being found in kind of large parts all over different parts of Africa. And so thinking about how these different actors might support each other in a mineral revolution as a version of the future I would like to see. Maybe that goes back to something we talked about earlier about the good life in the previous episode.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting, because we're coming to the grand finale, of the radio play, which is in proper kind of insurrectionary faction, is a revolutionary moment, which is something that feels like has been built up right from the beginning of the radio play. We sense that there is a point of reckoning with this destiny of minerals, and that's where, in terms of perhaps, we often do anthropologies of revolutions, aesthetics of revolutions. There are all kind of studies of human revolutions, but this is where I'm really fascinated about how a mineral revolution might sound or look like. I always find in semantics really some very, very interesting reasoning. So when the revolution are crushed, right? And here we're talking about stones having been crushed since the moment we laid eyes on them for all kind of purposes. So what does a mineral revolution would look or sound like? How did you envisage it becoming this climax of the radio play?
The idea of a mineral revolution kind of came about as I was writing the final act, and I was trying to end it on something hopeful, more specifically, because I felt like, Act 2 and Act 3 are very dark. Act 2 in particular, this kind of scream of magnetite, like how could they take you? I've imagined them as siblings, so like how could you take my sibling? And then in Act 3 it kind of drops to this almost darkest place in the entire piece, where it's about these forms of colonial violence, how they're enacted and why they're enacted. I can't really think of something much darker, to be honest. And so by the time you get to Act 4, where there is this sense of let's say, a human exploitation, or more specifically, a white European exploitation of minerals, I wanted to leave the viewer with something that wasn't so dark. So thinking about what kind of futures are possible, how might we engage with those futures. Even the kind of final line for me is quite Disney-esque, but it felt important that I was there. It's like, we're all connected. I kind of hated it, but I also didn't know how to end it better, if that makes sense. But it felt like there was something important about giving this sense of hope. Last spring, I did a workshop with students in the university in Berlin, mainly with architecture students, but also with electrical engineering ones. And we were talking about mineral intimacy, and I was outlining my research into, let's say, the colonial origins of mineralogy and the violence inherent in that. And if we think about those origins of mineralogy, what does that mean for our relationship to minerals in the present when we're becoming much more reliant on them for things like our technology, like our mobile phones, our laptops, or even a wind turbine or a hydroelectric plant? We're becoming much more resource-heavy human beings in the West in particular, but also across the globe. If we know all of our knowledge is coming from a colonial origin and we're thinking about a climate justice future, how do those two sit beside each other? And for me, they sit really uncomfortably, as in they don't work at all. And so it felt important to also think about different relationships to minerals that were not westernized. So in this case, thinking about the Atacameños and about the Sami. Also very important to make specific indigenous peoples, not an overarching term, but a specificity, as Nina, I'm sure you'll know from your research as well. But trying to pull this into both people and beings with autonomy to make their own choices, to have their own revolutions, to not be coerced, but also trying to give that sense of that's the future we can work towards. If we create these relationships, that's what we can support. And thinking about, quite often when you hear, especially papers, if anyone wants to read Making Kin with the Machine, do reach out to us on Instagram or email. We will happily send you the PDF. But a lot of what that paper talks about is reaching out to different indigenous epistemologies and questioning them. What kinds of relations and relationships can you have with technology, and by extension, the minerals within that technology? So there is a power that's already there within a lot of indigenous groups. And so how can we learn from that as Westerners to create our own connections and relationships that are empowering, that are dignified, that are revolutionary, anti-capitalist? It felt like I had to end on a revolution.
It sounds very appropriate to me, to be honest. I think that there is a sense to which we're almost trapped into this kind of false utopian horizons that will end up in a sort of like showdown, revolution, final sort of sense of retribution. And I think we have jokingly discussed this before. I think that the fact that the radio play works for me is exactly that it teaches at the edge of a possible Disney-fied versions where, a bit like, I don't know if you've ever seen B-movie, where the Bs are taking back the means of productions. It's like Disney doing Marxism, which can be almost like a death knell for anything to do with Marxism, but also reminds you that there are strange images of Walter Benjamin and Walt Disney kind of meeting in Hollywood that seems to connect the potentiality of animation to be, at least in their beginning, true radical endeavor to allow humans to think otherwise, right? To think otherwise, which I think is what is at the root of your play. So yeah, bring it on.
At the end of the work, you elaborate on themes or sort of introduce themes, depending on where you're entering the work. The notions of pulling blood from a stone and the act of trying to get rocks to talk. You very cleverly hint that perhaps we're the communication system for the rocks and minerals to communicate to each other. And the introduction of this idea makes me wonder what's next for you with the work. And, this is a satisfying ending in itself for the project, but do you have any thoughts on where else this work might lead to?
There's a few things that maybe I've hinted at the conversation with. I can't actually know how minerals might speak, so using fiction as a tool, or even the play as a tool, kind of even the fact that it's an audio play rather than an acted out play, because it's trying to think about them being voices. Lots of people kept on telling me about the scene towards the end of Everything Everywhere All at Once, where you have two rocks on the edge of a cliff and you just get subtitles on the bottom, because we know that the two actors in the film can both speak English, but we don't know what their voices might sound like as rocks, and how their mouths might move if they have mouths, and yada yada. So audio play felt like appropriate. In terms of this outro, but as this piece in a space will be played on a loop, also intro, I was trying to first describe what pulling blood from a stone means. To English speaking audience, it's a common phrase. It's like pulling blood from a stone, but globally not so much. And then as I sort of dug into it, I was thinking more about this idea of what that's said in the work is kind of what happens if you equate your ability to speak with the blood in your veins. What does that mean if you don't have blood, or what does that mean if you find it difficult to speak? And there's many reasons why that might be, the soft-spoken or the non-verbal or the inanimate or so forth. That list is in the work. And I think I was almost trying to use that conclusion to maybe point out the mistakes in the radio play, if that makes sense. Also, this idea of anthropomorphizing, it's always going to be limiting, because there's only so much I can know, and it's in the entire work is subjective ultimately. I think where that kind of leads me to is this process of further listening, and kind of what I'm most interested in maybe gathering from this play is both this attention to time and kind of thinking about these ways of collapsing it or engaging with it, or thinking about minerals as carriers of time. Kind of most time when you hold a rock, it's going to be at least 1,000 years old. But similarly, calcite, which is usually, if you see little stalactites growing in underground tunnels or in train stations, they're usually calcite. How are those carriers of time through their formation? And I think more specifically in kind of opening at this question of, are we speaking through minerals, or are minerals speaking through us, or what's that connection and engagement? It kind of makes me go back to a lot of the premise of the research, which is, if we understand our relationship to minerals to be based off of a colonized science or a colonial form of science, how do we work against that to create new connections or different relationships that are not premised in extraction or othering or categorization or all these things that colonialism is great at doing? How do we root it in this connection of trying to have a conversation? In terms of what I would love to do with it next, I would love to take this research into Namibia. I'd love to go and just spend time listening and talking and having conversations and trying to think about what a relationship to a mineral might be like in other parts of the world, whether that be through an indigenous wisdom or that be through, let's say, a layman's wisdom. That's kind of where I see it going next, and working through audio as well, because it has this great speculative or fictional quality of, you don't know the face of the voice. The voice could be anyone. It could be a human, but it could be a rock, it could be a mountain, it could be a mine.
I don't know where I've heard this from. I don't know whether it's from another fictional story or whether it's like some crazy stoner theory, but about it's relating to production of wheat and how potentially we're not the ones that are growing the wheat, we're the vessel for the wheat to multiply. And that relationship between us being the users of the wheat, actually maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the wheats are the users of us, and we have the capacity to be able to collect enough water for them for it to grow. But when you suggest that actually maybe we're the communication technology for the rocks to communicate with each other, it did make me think, and I know that this is not what you're this is not your intention with the work at all. But it did make me wonder when people refer to the climate crisis as climate change. People say, oh, like the climate's always changing. And someone had said something like, we need to stop talking about it as the end of the world, because the world won't end. Humanity might end, but the world won't end. The world won't end. And I think about what would be left behind would be rocks anyway. So I'm not sort of being like, it's the rocks' fault. Maybe
it is. Maybe their revolution is to kick us out. Maybe that's their good life.
Me do it. Yeah. It wasn't us, it's the rocks that made me do it. That's what he was saying. Yeah. Oh my God, the whole history was them sending us a message. I just wanted to kind of round up, and probably we are in the timing of rounding up. In a sense, what I find beautifully ambitious about this work, and therefore leading to other forms, is exactly this sense of reconstituting other ways of narrating a story. If even at best, if what we get out of this is a new narration, is another story, is another way of telling a story. We know the story, in a sense, are themselves. Narration predates all human activities. Therefore, there is a sense that a new narration, however is circulated at whatever range it managed to circulate at, it kind of instigate a different possible relationship, and even if it goes close to whatever sort of strange mainstream versions of these new narrations are, perhaps Hollywood scriptwriters are just hungry for new stories, and we are there for them to feed them into. But I think that there is definitely, I definitely feel there is an extended version, and a further elaboration of all the knowledge that you have collected here. You mentioned going to Namibia, and I think that there is definitely the sense that minerals are rewriting their futures already, in a sense, by becoming so central to our way of life in other forms, in new forms, in different forms, that will only reasonably spill over into different places for their own future. It might be that a particular mineral might be the only solution for another pandemic, a particular mineral that becomes the ultimate savior of our species, because of their unique properties, as it has been in the past, right? In a certain kind of way. I do feel that there are possible continuations or new formations of this material in itself. It leads to so many other possible structures, but it definitely feels that it's, if one can say, it attempts to construct stories out of time, but it's very timely, for sure. It does feel very timely, because we are in a particular moment where we speak of minerals all the time. If it wasn't just for the fact that their batteries are so much sort of, in a sense, keeping us into the lifestyle that we are, and they will become even more sort of battery technology and minerals, therefore, are at the center of our future, one way or another.
Yeah.
So the narrative around, I don't know, I think the narrative around batteries is like, there's kind of the pollution of them is what will kill us, but then also there's a narrative of like switching from fossil fuels to batteries is what will save us. So there's a really confusing narrative on what they're gonna do for us.
And I think for me, the part of the reason why, maybe that kind of timeliness that you're talking about, Alberto, but the reason why I wanted to make a work like this in the present, let's say, is that it's becoming increasingly obvious that climate and social justice are intertwined. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that climate policy and, let's say, global ways of addressing climate crisis or climate breakdown are nationalized or are focused on what, let's say, emissions look like in the West. There isn't this planetary sense. And I think on the back of that, there isn't also an owning up of the forms of harm which predominantly Western European countries, but also just anywhere in the global north, have committed onto the global south, and the convenience and the wealth that we maintain through that. So it feels like in order for there to be a climate social justice, there needs to be an addressing and a facing up of colonial harm from both the past and the present, and this ongoing cycle that exists within that. And that's kind of why, I mean, that's the thing that sort of drives me in the work, is that as we have this desire to make big batteries, to make wind turbines and solar panels and electric cars and all these things which are supposed to be, the saviors of our future, there isn't the same understanding of, okay, well, I have the wealth to buy an electric car because of this kind of salary that I can earn in a city like London. Not that I can own an electric car, but for example, there's an ability for me in my future to do that. That is much, much farther away for someone who lives in Sumeb than it is for me. Where does that come from? Why does it work that way, despite the fact that a lot of the minerals required to make that battery would also be mined in a country like Namibia? So that's kind of that's the timeliness, and I think that's sort of the projection of where the work is going to go to, is trying to address or think about these questions of, what kinds of wealth or convenience or luxury do we maintain within Europe, within the US, and so forth, that are not afforded to those, I'm thinking particularly those across the African continent, and particularly in Namibia. Why are those means of wealth not afforded to regular Namibians? I mean, they are to white people living in Namibia, but not to the rest of the population. Why is that? In all the complexity of why that is, and what are means of thinking through minerals that address that to get to a closer form of climate justice that, is about the good life, is about renewable infrastructure, is about dignity and equality and all those good things.
Okay, I think sadly we're going to have to stop there, but you kind of left us on the edge of our seats with what you might do next, which is really exciting. Thank you so much for sharing this brilliant work. And it's a shame that we couldn't be recording this from Berlin and seeing your show alongside it. And and thank you so much to Alberto for joining us for this 2-part episode.
It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. You said brilliant. Can I say shining? I think I'm not ashamed. It's good. I think that considering how polished stones can acquire all kind of properties exactly by being able to do that. I am really looking forward to see where this goes next. But thank you so much for involving us in this conversation that looked at the works in so far. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Okay.
Anyone in London want to invite me to show the work here? It's not coming to London yet, and I would love it to. So.
Yes, any curators listening to this who are really interested in bringing this to London, please get in touch with Niamh.
Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Cool. All right.
Great. Okay, we'll see you. Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll see you in 2 months.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Niamh. Bye-bye.